for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar exploring tips for challenger brands in the pharma sector. Today's discussion features a range of industry and Ipsos healthcare experts, and they will introduce themselves shortly. Let me add that all the panel participants represent their personal views only today and not those of their companies or specific brands they lead or work on. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's discussion moderator, Neil Kieran, a partner in our healthcare advisory practice. Neil, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Hi, and welcome everyone to our webinar panel. I'm joined by my esteemed panelists here from across the biopharma sector, as Ellen mentioned. We're here today to talk about helping pharma challenger brands win in today's highly competitive and complex times. I'm Neil Kieran, Executive Leader in Commercial Strategy at Ipsos Healthcare Advisory. I bring expertise in this topic with 20 plus years of diverse experience, having worked directly in the life sciences sector, in top-tier management consulting, and at leading healthcare marketing agencies. You might say I've seen it all to some degree. I'd like our highly established panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Steve Gerling.
Oh, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve, and a special thanks to Pablo, Anuj, Bill, and Bill for joining us today. It's a real privilege to have you on the panel with us. I've been at Ipsos for 7 years. I lead the healthcare business in North America. I've had a variety of cell and supplier side roles throughout my career, and more recently, last 15 years or so in strategy consulting at organizations like Leerink Swan, Omnicom, with the CDM strategy group, and Campbell Alliance, which became Inventive Health, which you might now know as Syneos. So looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, and Pablo, if you'd like to go next.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Pablo Lapuerta. I'm a physician. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for about 25 years. Right now, I'm CEO of an exciting new startup, 4M Therapeutics. And my background in industry, I've worked across a lot of therapeutic areas, and I spent about half of my time in industry as a chief medical officer.
Great, thank you. And Anuj?
Hey, thanks, Neil. Welcome, everyone. Glad to participate today. And I've been working in pharma for about 20 years, and I've got an interesting viewpoint too, because I've worked on both the biosimilars and generic side of the business as well as the innovative side. So I've seen all kinds of competition, and I'll share with you what I've experienced. But I'm really interested to hear from the rest of the panel as well. So thanks for inviting me, Neil.
Thank you. And Bill Renzo?
How you doing? Bill Renzo here. Been in pharma, mostly on the payer side, for almost 30 years. Currently at Ascendis, leading pricing, contracting, and distribution. So like Neil, I've seen a lot. Spent about 8 years on the agency side, where I launched over 30 brands for a variety of different organizations. So excited to be part of the panel. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Bill Gibson?
Hi, Neil. Thanks for the opportunity to join. Bill Gibson. I'm with ASI for the last 3.5 years in our neurology business group. Prior to that, I spent about 19 years at Bristol Myers Squibb in a number of different therapeutic areas and different roles in US and global, largely commercial. And I got my start at what's now IQVIA, at the time IMS Health, working with their subnational databases. So pleasure to be part of the conversation today. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone. I'm really excited about this discussion and to have you all here. So thank you so much for joining. So to set the context around our discussion today, to the good fortune of patients, treatment for most conditions has progressed substantially in the last few decades, as we all know. So therapeutics have progressed from being solely small molecule to also include recombinant DNA technology or biologics, the first approval of which was in 1982. Since 1980, heart disease deaths have dropped by over 50% in the US. Targeted therapies for cancer, both heme and solid tumor, have become a true reality. Since the late 1990s, new classes of antiretroviral therapies for HIV have extended life post-diagnosis by 50 plus years. Since 2014, conditions like hepatitis C now essentially have cures. Cell therapy hit a breakthrough in 2006 with induced pluripotent stem cells, and 2017 saw the first gene therapy reaching the bedside with CAR Ts. and the innovations go on and on. So really, I mean, as wonderful as this is for society, for most conditions, stakeholders often have so many therapeutic options to consider that a new brand might go entirely unnoticed. So it's a conundrum for biopharma manufacturers. To that end, how can a challenger brand make a mark and ultimately win at launch despite these challenges? So when thinking about market maturity or saturation versus brand or portfolio position, there are some important considerations. Whether a market is very immature or mature, a biopharma manufacturer might encounter significant challenges in either case. Being closer to the middle of the horizontal or x-axis here is generally easier. We're all familiar with a number of disease areas that fall across this spectrum. On the low maturity side would be many rare diseases, several genetic conditions, unknown viruses, such as even COVID-19 back in early 2020, right? That would fall on the left there. More mature markets would include CV metabolic, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, antipsychotics, etc. Disease areas that are generally in more of that sweet spot include much of oncology, neurology, immunology, ophthalmology, infectious disease, etc. So not surprisingly, this is where most of R&D spend in the sector is focused today. When considering brand or portfolio position, being above the illustrated line is really ideal. So particularly above the line and in the blue zone is preferred. And today we're going to talk about pretty much everything else. So with that, not kind of the ideal position, but everything else here, right? So with that, let's consider some scenarios for our panel to discuss. I'm going to go off camera here. So first, let's consider a pharma brand that is late to market and or in a highly competitive space. And I'd love, Bill Renzo, would love to hear your thoughts here to kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. So, it's an interesting when you're kind of late to the market, and the chart you just showed, had rheumatoid arthritis on there. Just the past few years, I had launched, Kevzara into the market, right? 13th product to join the space in rheumatoid arthritis, and we knew that access was going to be, costly based on some of the category dynamics we were seeing, and the big market leaders, Humira, Embo, they were heavily entrenched, with their customers, primarily as a result of the heavy rebating that was going on. So we weren't going to be able to really win everywhere. So we made a decision really just to go deep strategically with a very small number of key customers. That was going to give us the opportunity to really build momentum. So we did that. And once we did win access with one of the big PBMs, we tried to really make sure that the team was ready to go out and use the tools, most importantly, the messaging, because IL-6s were not generally used first line, although from a label perspective, it could be. A habit already entrenched with rheumatologists was TNF, 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 right? So, we put together a very strong messaging platform around first line. The whole pull-through process was critical, because what we've seen is a lot of these PBMs don't have the patience to wait a year for you to build up market access. They've got fiduciary responsibilities to their custom accounts, so they have rebates that they have to pay. So, the takeaway for us really was that as a late to the market, challenger brand, it's critical that we had really all the parts of the organization aligned to make the most of each win and ultimately create like a halo effect with physicians around access and having confidence in coverage. That's the approach we took, and we're very successful with that approach.
No, that's great, Bill. Thanks very much. And Anuj, I would love to hear your thoughts on further considerations to add here.
I think it's super interesting. When I think about highly competitive space, reflecting my experiences in biosimilars, you got a product where basically you don't have a lot of differentiation on the data side. So this is where you bring out your marketing chops. We're kind of lucky in our industry with these, blockbuster launches. You got patent protection, you got highly differentiated data. You're the best. But hey, your marketeers come out when you got to compete, and it's like Pepsi and Coke, they got to go head to head. Apple and Samsung, they got to go head to head. So I think understanding your customers really well, finding opportunities to deliver differentiation through marketing and having really, strong sales teams who can build relationships and convert, I think that's when you get to show up. And I think we're needing to do it more and more. In oncology side, portfolios have grown so big because we've made so much progress on the science. So you're rarely going out there with products that are on their own. You gotta compete, and we learn a lot from our experiences in biosimilars.
Yeah, totally agreed. It really is kind of these situations when marketing really comes to bear, right? Otherwise, you do hear a lot of challenges in the industry about what's the value add there. So this is where it really matters. So now let's jump to a sub scenario here. So say that we've got the same context, right? But your brand also has little to no profile distinction. So make it a little bit more challenging. Pablo, what say you in this situation?
Well, I always find attractive the challenge of coming up with a novel clinical strategy. And a good example is the SGLT inhibitor class. Highly competitive, right? And a perception of class effects. And they're really making their mark on the treatment of heart failure. Now, sotagliflozin comes in as a late entrant, and the heart failure market seems covered by the competitors. They have studies in preserved ejection fraction, reduced ejection fraction, people with and without diabetes. Where can you go? Well, it turns out that the sotagliflozin team found a place in recognizing that all these other studies were outpatient studies. So they moved to an inpatient setting. You can randomize against placebo. The Soloist trial was published as a success in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it drove a lot the value of Lexicon.
No, great example there, Pablo. Thank you. So now let's say we go above brand even and say these are portfolio concerns. Steve, would love to hear your thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to bring a franchise leadership, sort of framework and thinking to the plan. Think about how robust our portfolio is, what the role of our both in market or kind of life cycle potential is relative to kind of competitive intensity. I'd really want to make sure that we had productive partnerships with key stakeholders in the healthcare community. I'd absolutely want to figure out how to bring a patient first philosophy, bidirectional engagement with patients, digitally deliberate strategies. And it goes without saying, if we've got the time and the clinical innovation, scientific leadership, and if possible over the longer cycle, market guidelines and standards are all really big levers.
No, all great points there, Steve. And thanks all for just the wonderful thoughts here. Going to share a little bit of a few things to reiterate from my perspective. So when late to a competitive market is suggested, to differentiate, it's really about finding your niche. So you need to know your strengths and how to use them, whether that be database, biomarker, patient subgroup, etc., or via dosing, administration, quality of life measures, via execution by reaching the right stakeholders better, via pricing strategically, figuring out the entry point that's going to give you the best kind of return, or via stakeholder positioning and knowing who to target and with what message. These are all ways you can still win, right? When you've got a situation with little to no profile distinction, you have to consider corporate strength, disease area leadership. So for example, your thought leader relationships that you already have in place, your field force, different areas that you already have some strength in. Can these things help? You might want to consider alternative indications, combinations, or market entry strategy. Sometimes it's worthwhile to look outside of your category or even your industry for inspiration. I think it was Anuj that mentioned this. So for example, like, how does Hershey's do it, right? In the land of chocolate bars, how does Hershey's win? That's something that might be worth thinking about, of course, within the pharma sector as well. So nonetheless, even with all of this, sometimes you've got a dog, right? We have to admit it. And you have to realize when you're better off cutting your losses and selling perhaps to someone better positioned to find value from it. So it's something to always factor in there. And finally, about be there, if these are portfolio or corporate considerations, generally you should think to invest in your leader. Think about combos, bundling for payers, where investment would maximize potential versus divesting to cut losses. possibly finding the right partner to supplement your pipeline. So if you know your pipeline isn't quite as strong in certain areas where the market needs to be, where patients need help, where the real unmet need is there, look into that, right? Ultimately, you have to figure out where the patient unmet need is, and that competition is missing pretty much, and try to invest there. But thanks everyone for the great input there. So moving on to scenario number 2, you think you've got something special, but you're not sure yet. So Bill Gibson, what would you do here?
Well, Neil, I think this really requires just a very deep understanding of the market drivers and really an understanding of the customer insights that are driving current behavior. So an example that comes to mind is when immuno-oncology was first moving into the renal cell carcinoma space after having made initial entry several years ago into metastatic melanoma, non-small cell lung cancer. Nivolumab or Opdivo in renal cell carcinoma was very promising at that time, and that it was the first to market with an overall survival benefit in a tumor with treatment goals that were in many ways largely palliative. And so there was a heavy focus at that time on objective response, progression-free survival. But the Opdivo launch was special because it had the opportunity to shift the overall survival discussion forward on the strength of durable survival as a real key reason to believe. And so we believe this would be transformative. We thought this was special, but certainly we weren't sure if it would be credible. And so that's a big shift to make in a tumor type. But in the end, I think it was a really important one that through market research, we were able to confirm that the approach would be compelling. And in fact, it enabled us to really start a new conversation in the marketplace.
No, that's a great example, Bill. Thank you so much for that. And Bill Renzo, do you have anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, I mean, just a few things. So, it's funny when you say you think you have something special, but you're not sure. I mean, just go out and speak to one of the payers. They're going to tell you real quick how special or not special, your new product is. We're going through that right now, in the launch of our product for growth hormone deficiency, for pediatric growth hormone deficiency, right? Here's a category. That's the closest you're going to get to branded generics, really, is growth hormone, right? It's a space that payers haven't spoken about in years, and their philosophy is, it's probably more cosmetic in nature than it is. So having to explain to them the hidden costs in these patients, I think, was critical for us to really start to differentiate ourselves from the dailies with the weekly product. So, you have to make sure that the customers really understand that what they have now is not as good as they think it is from a cost perspective. So it's really going out and really understanding what they know or don't know and educating them prior to launch. And you got to make a decision at some point. Are you going to do a value play or are you going to do a volume play? Two big different marketing strategies. So, I mean, I think that was a big takeaway in launching into a space where we weren't sure if we had something that was special.
That's a great example for sure. Yeah, and in that example, Bill, if I could probe a little further, how did you land in terms of the value, the value play versus broader?
Yeah, I think ultimately, realized that it has to be a volume play. Because the days of trying to get medical exceptions, and keeping in mind we launched with one indication versus the short actings that had 6 or 7 indications, right? We also noticed that most, even though there's 7 short actings on the market, we noticed that most payers were just covering 1 or 2. So that kind of gave us a good glimpse into what their behavior was going to be like, and also having to understand from payers and not lose your credibility when you're launching into growth hormone deficiency, and payers are looking at all the oncology products that they need to cover, gene therapy coming down the pike. They only have so many dollars. So, you have to really understand the market you're launching into, try to differentiate yourself so that you can get some coverage for this product, and then let the physicians drive, the prescribing.
No, totally makes sense. So that's great. And Pablo, what are your thoughts here? Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, it reminds me of the early days of Orencia, treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. Back around 2001, the market leader was Enbrel. And Orencia had a slightly different mechanism of action. It wasn't really a TNF-alpha inhibitor. And there was a lot of pressure to try to come up with differentiation with head-to-head data against Enbrel. you couldn't get enough Enbrel to do a head-to-head study. It was in such short supply, it was being used by patients. And the solution there ended up being to study the drug in people who had failed Enbrel. It was a courageous decision. It provided very significant benefit to those patients. And then when it finally came to market, we saw something special because we saw something that was clearly a different mechanism of action. If you can fail Enbrel and benefit from Orencia, and that really helped with the launch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. That's totally kind of, to your point, it sounds like one of the more pioneering ones in the space of thinking about that kind of, failure population and how you really add incremental value to what's already out there. So that's great. Yeah, thanks everyone. Great input. Only a few things to add here from my end. So, it's one of those situations where you really need that next level research and analysis to identify where to invest. So looking for key stakeholder perspectives like ad boards, other primary research, they're all fair game here. Building out a valuation model and evaluating it. So consider the forecast, the cost of investment, the probability of technical and regulatory success. All of these factors are really important in ultimately making these decisions on how you move forward there. Set thresholds and consider metrics to help inform go, no go, invest more or less. So when you've got like hard thresholds, benchmarks in mind to consider, it helps you kind of really, take away a little bit of that bias and identify if this really is something special or if it's not. So this is clearly an area where competitive intelligence becomes key too. So particularly to understand how your brand stands out at a granular level, for example, kind of referencing some of those examples that the panel mentioned. The more you understand your competition, the easier it is to know really where you can play in that space. Also, of course, it's always important to be aware of brand team bias. So internally in a pharma manufacturer, things may seem great and rosy, but they're not always as amazing externally or when factoring in the PTRS, et cetera, as they might seem internally. So just be sure to inform your hypotheses and make decisions objectively, right? So, okay. All right, so moving on to scenario 3 here. Say you're facing competition with more novel MOAs, which we know is definitely the case for a number of disease areas today. Pablo, would love to turn to you again here. What would you consider doing in this situation?
Well, I think one of the things that is really important in an established brand is safety. And some people are very concerned about studying safety. I've heard an expression, unfortunately, I haven't heard it in at least 10 years. You don't want to shoot yourself in the foot by studying safety. I think the answer is the reverse. You help yourself when you're studying safety because you give physicians a real world path to be confident about the drug and to make sure that they have the best outcomes. If you're doing research on this, well, and you're doing it well, you're the good guys. And a lot of questions will be around some of these novel MOAs that don't have that type of background and experience and that sort of emphasis in the relationship between the sponsor and the physician community.
No, that's a great point for sure, and it's definitely one of the first ones that comes to mind for me as well. So if I'll open this up if any other panelists have something they'd like to add at this parent level, please let me know. Otherwise, I will move to the next sub scenario. Anyone like to add anything at the parent level here? Okay. So let's go to a more specific sub scenario here. Say that you're already in market facing competition with that more novel MOA like on the horizon, right? So Steve, how about your thoughts here?
So this scenario screams some sort of competitive response initiative, a project where we really take a close look in collaboration with our cross-functional stakeholders at what the potential clinical profile is and what the possible claims and likely positioning for that soon to launch asset might be. build on some hypothesized positioning with your cross-functional groups, really pressure test, all the way down to likely strategies for your competitor, likely execution tactics for your competitor. It doesn't have to take too long, but that allows you to build a pretty robust view of your responses as the in-market brand. And I think that we've had some pretty successful stories dating back a few years on that on this sort of approach, but a challenging one certainly.
Definitely, but definitely aligned with that perspective. That's clearly one of the ways that you can really try to win in that space and hold your position. So great points there. Now let's say you enter after them. So flipping the script a little bit here, where I know I would love to call on Anuj here. So I know you've got great experience, particularly and not that you have to reference this specifically, but your experience with leading biosimilars, for example. So would love to hear what you think here.
Yeah, it's curious. I think it's fun going through these scenarios, racking the brain on what's going to happen in the past. I think there's two parts to this. One is leaning into your strengths. If you're late to the market, your competitor is already positioned out there. You have all the data in the world around how to work strategically. So I think from a strategic perspective, you can actually work from an advantage being the second mover or late mover into the market. And then the other piece, based on a lot of the work I do today, I wanted to build on what Pablo said, which is about that patient experience really. And I'm really proud that in oncology, our conversations have moved from, therapies for devastating diseases, but the therapies themselves have devastating consequences to, hey, now we have options where we can really make the life of that patient so much better and transformed in a completely different way. And maybe today and looking forward, it's how do we lean into making that patient experience awesome, right? We're not just pharma companies that throw medicines into the marketplace and sell them at a high price. No, we're actually making an incredible experience for patients. And I know there are consumer companies are more used to engaging directly with their end users, but it's something we need to learn to do well. And this is our opportunity. Our new generation of pharma associates, I think, are ready to take on this battle.
No, that's a great point. Yeah, I think that you start to see kind of evolution in the sector. It's finally starting to happen. It feels like where there is starting to be, it's there's that realization of how important the patient experience is, as the end consumer in the situation here, where I think with the sector, it gets a little bit muddied because, typically the buyers are thought of as the payers and the physicians, the MDs, et cetera. So yeah, great points there. Yeah, so from my perspective, only a few things to add here. So this is just to reiterate, novel essentially means less precedence, and therefore it's more speculative and risky. So to Pablo's point about safety, right? You just got to leverage that. So novel also might mean more expensive. Definitely draw attention to that too, right? Similar to any product category, it's like your narrative, and you have to tell that story. So it's really important to own that narrative. Tell the story that you want people to know about the problem, about your brand, the novel competitor, etc. I wouldn't let the novel entrant own the story or preempt it ideally. So also even draw that category map for key stakeholders. So tell them where your brand fits and how they should consider using the more novel MOA. So the more you kind of own that story and shape it, emphasize on the less precedence, emphasize on kind of the things about your brand that kind of hold your position, the more I think you're really, positioning your brand properly and doing, what's really right for patients in the end of the day, right? So that these are things that actually matter to patients and should be brought to the forefront. So finally, simply better execution can also go a long way. So contracting, patient assistance, group engagement, thought leader relationships, patient services, all of these things can make a huge difference. And that touches on more of the point that Anuj was expanding on at the end there. It's just executing with all of this stuff can really help, and it's all pretty key. So. Okay, so moving on to scenario number 4. Let's now consider a less mature market. So let's say you're entering one that is relatively underdeveloped or even unknown. So Steve, I would love to hear your thoughts here to kick us off.
You gave me the unknown market.
Sorry.
Thanks, no pressure. I think so assuming that we're kind of in a rare envelope, or something similar, novel, kind of novel scenario in oncology. I think that the best thing that we can do is get close to what we can possibly hear from the market, from physicians and patients. Just carefully listen and observe, and be open to the nuances that may be driving that nascent market into to action. Pressure test what the potential engagement levels are, but I say that with a little bit of caution because you might have to create the engagement levels, and the path to care is likely not that well established, and use that kind of frame of reference to drive your go-to-market options, but a tricky one. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. No, great point, Steve. It's definitely agreed that there's so much creation that needs to happen. It's challenging, in itself, but also kind of really an opportunity, right? When you create those engagement levers, you've really got something there, right? That's hard to displace when folks might come after. So, great points there. So also, Bill Gibson would love to hear your thoughts here. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think similarly, it's not so much it being an unknown area, but certainly an underdeveloped, largely underdeveloped area would be Alzheimer's disease. It's underdeveloped in terms of the way patients are identified or self-identify within the current framework, how patients are diagnosed, how they are informed throughout that process, as well as the policies or lack thereof to support these key priorities. So in addition, there's a social stigma to the disease that carries a certain dynamic in which these individuals and the families that are living along with them with this disease, particularly in the early stages, I think, often live in a state of denial for what can be a really long, prolonged period of time. And at the same time, their primary care physicians and providers have in the past, I think, lacked the sort of diagnostic tools and clarity, and the important treatments, of course, that could potentially impact the course of the disease. And so this all adds up into sort of a symbiotic avoidance behavior in the early stages. And of course, as we're learning, the science is moving, as we like to say, to the left, meaning earlier patient identification enriched with the right confirmation of pathology is really, we believe, the window to effectively treat and alter the course of the illness. So this avoidance and denial coupling together really creates a challenge. And of course, primary care are understandably focused on other more urgent, definable health priorities. You mentioned earlier heart disease, diabetes, some of the others in elder care, which naturally should take precedence. So all of this really means that any commercialization plans have to really rest on a very solid foundation of education, public awareness. I think very importantly, establishment of such medical and reimbursement policies that can really favor and support and encourage early detection, diagnosis, and ultimately care. I think it's important to mention this really can't be done alone. It's not a solo industry player game. This is really something that needs to be done, as you had shown on the last slide, in close collaboration with patient advocacy groups, with professional societies, with many other stakeholders. And there are, I think, and have been opportunities for even pre-competitive engagement throughout industry to really try to make movement on these macro challenges.
No, all great points there, Bill. That particularly like you mentioned, thinking about Alzheimer's disease and how like most people would say, you would think it's been around for a long time, like people know about it, but from all the points you mentioned, because of kind of the lack of hope that's been in that area for so long, and the other kind of maybe more pressing factors that have historically led to death or led to complications, it's kind of been pushed to the wayside, and people don't want that diagnosis early. So yeah, I mean, there is a lot of clearly market building work that needs to happen there. So definitely a great example for sure. And so
Hey, Neil,
Bill,
one other
yeah.
thought, Neil, is because we're going through this right now at Ascendis. I would highly encourage, if you're going into an underdeveloped market, to engage with payers very early. They need to understand what the disease is. They need to understand how you plan to market this responsibly. And I would suggest that as you engage with payers early, you work with them to shape the criteria. Because if you don't, they're going to end up putting a criteria above and beyond your label, and then you got to try to turn that around, and that's like, moving the Titanic. So engage early, let them understand the disease, educate them, what the costs to them are, what these patients are costing the system, what physicians are thinking, and shape that criteria early.
Yeah.
Great point for sure. Yeah, I don't know if Bill Gibson, if you have anything you want to respond with there, but I know you were.
Couldn't agree more. I'm sorry to cut you off, Neil. No, I couldn't agree more with Bill Renzo's comments. I mean, this is really a space where it comes to value definition. We'll come back to this, I'm sure, throughout the rest of the discussion. But value here needs to be viewed on a much different horizon. This isn't a disease area where a payer will see offsets within a calendar or fiscal year. The offsets in many cases, as you were alluding, Neil, are going to come over potentially decades. And so there need to be really very structurally different approaches to looking at how to award a payer for what we believe is doing the right thing, if indeed the treatment intervention does prove its ability to slow the course of the illness. That's a tall order. But if that is the case, then it needs to be seen as a longer term investment rather than a near term cost with no real near-term payoff for the payer. And so I think the criteria is part of that, but also broadly, I think just generally understanding the medical value proposition of this type of innovation is going to be increasingly important for the industry.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I mean, to this one, since, definitely there's some energy around this, is anyone else have anything to add here? Going once, going twice. Okay. All right. Yeah. So mainly, this is again just reiterating a few points here myself. So basically, it's all about market building. And ultimately disease awareness, symptom characterization, finding and partnering with patients, patient assistance groups, what was mentioned, right? Finding those thought leaders, mapping them, forming relationships. HCP and payer education to the points there at the end, specifically diagnostic establishment, all of that is pretty key, right? So you need to, it's basically your kind of apple pie to make, and you're going to get back what you put into it. So if it's an area where you really see opportunity and you really see high patient unmet need, you've just got to build that market and think about, collaborators, partners, all angles as much as possible, and positioning yourselves in the right light, as came up from the last few points there on the payer side, right, with utilization, and beyond that, to Bill Gibson's point about all the different areas to think about there. So great points. Okay, so moving on to scenario 5. So say you have limited commercial dollars or infrastructure to rival competitors. What do you do in this situation? Anuj, would love to hear your thoughts here to kick us off.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We have this challenge across the board now in pharma. It used to be, hey, the generics and biosimilar competitors are the ones to deal with it. But now on the innovative side too, since there's such a large basket of products, is like, where do you put your money? And a lot of it's about, hey, how do we drive new products and new launches, which means everybody's scrambling for where do we put our money. And I think here, the better we understand our customers and the better we understand the levers for success, the more success we can have over the long run. And I think the key part for me is understanding where you are in the product's journey. Often we start a whole bunch of initiatives at launch and we build on them and we add more and we add more, but that's not necessarily what the product needs through its entire life cycle. So I think upfront, really pinpointing what are some of the key drivers. I think is really interesting to hear, Bill Renzo, your perspective on the payer side, because that's, I mean, the access part's so critical up front and thinking about those elements. But then as you think about what's needed later on in the life cycle, you may find out that the patient perspective dominates. And yeah, so think about, you know, what's really needed for the product at this particular point in its life.
I really like the framework thinking there, Anuj. Thanks for that. Yeah, and Bill Gibson, do you have anything you'd like to add here?
Yeah, I think, you know, in situations like this, the key is really, as I mentioned earlier, I think starting a new conversation, just as Anuj was saying, is trying to change the dialogue in the market. And there's an example that comes to mind for me, which was aripiprazole or Abilify in the behavioral health space. Initially, when it launched, it was launching into just a really well-formed marketplace. I mean, you had Lilly, Pfizer, AstraZeneca that had inhabited the space for quite some time. BMS at the time was a new player in the space. It was competing, you know, with a new agent, relatively unknown agent at the time. But the profile was so unique, and I think the benefit-risk profile in particular looked and felt, and it was experienced much differently by patients and investigators, that it was able to catalyze really a kind of a new conversation about what can a behavioral health medication look and feel like in market and versus other treatments. And so there was a lot of disease education that was able to shine a light, I think, on important treatment considerations, looking at the totality of the wellness of the patient. And I think that really helped to catalyze a very, very important place for that drug to come into its own. And in fact, you know, I think over time really began to create a new market in the process. We also spoke about this, I think, a little bit earlier with respect to Opdivo. It's sort of changing that conversation. So if it's a PFS market, how can you make it an overall survival market? You know, Opdivo was robustly successful in doing that because the treatment aspirations were fungible.
No, great points for sure, and definitely great examples there, Bill. Thanks for that. Yeah, and Bill Renzo, would you like to add anything to this one also?
Yeah, just a few comments. I mean, I would, you know, looking from a payer perspective, I think you would kind of have to look at first, you know, is this a payer launch or is it not, right? I mean, if you're launching third line in oncology, payers may not be as relevant to you, right? So you don't need to overly invest there. But if it is a payer launch, clearly, and it's going to be a volume play, you know, I would say starting from the beginning, starting with the right people, right? You have to have people who are going to be relevant. Do they have access to key decision makers at CVS, ESI, and Optum, or do they not? And you have to have a seat at the table. I always said, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're on the plate for lunch. That's really what it goes down to. So I think that's the most important thing, and developing that value proposition, right? You know, why should they put this product on formulary? So I think if you're going to invest, you got to invest in the people first, and then a very strong value proposition moving forward.
Totally.
Yeah, Bill, that reminds me of just another comment around the aripiprazole experience. You mentioned value versus volume earlier, which I think is just a great way to capture the thought. You know, aripiprazole, I think, did the same thing, established its price and value in schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. So it's clearly in a specialty space, but then expanded into major depressive disorder as adjunctive or second line therapy in many ways. And so that became sort of a very friendly payer play, even though it was at a specialty price versus a sea of generics. But I think that was a really good example of where the value proposition was such that we got the right patient at the right time, and were able to demonstrate the unique benefits that the product had been known for without really, I would say, with very modest contracting and gross to net. So it was a very winning formula, but it was really playing to the value story.
Hey, Neil, it feels like we were having this conversation just this morning.
Yes, exactly.
You know? and we have a situation all the time where, you know, our clients come to us and say, you know, I've got these mighty aspirations, and I you know, I need to invest in this whole portfolio of activities. But to kind of tie what, you know, Bill and Anuj were saying, you know, figuring out what the context of our go-to-market or our launch, you know, plan might be, and getting really precise on that, where you are, what the assumptions are, kind of how can we pressure test those, and what you need to know now and in the next planning window. I think takes a lot of courage and motivation across our client base, but actually that's the best way to kind of get that fact base or baseline established.
Yeah, 100%, couldn't agree more. So, and exactly, it's so relevant to our conversation just this morning. So it's funny, but it does come up all the time with clients as reference. So
Neil,
yeah,
can I add something about the Abilify experience? That's our
yeah,
papers. Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to thank Bill and the rest of the Everpapersol team at BMS and Otsuka for what they did with the drug. I have a cousin who's been on it for over a decade, and I can't thank the team enough.
oh,
We did something very unusual with a very limited amount of dollars and infrastructure to set Abilify apart. The market leader was olanzapine, Zyprexa, an extraordinary drug that revolutionized the treatment of schizophrenia. And what we knew at the time is that in our clinical studies, there didn't seem to be as much weight gain with Abilify compared to olanzapine. But in these clinical studies, they're only 6 months. The difference was 3 pounds, right? I was seeing patients with schizophrenia at the time in clinic, and I saw patients who had gained 30 pounds on olanzapine. And I knew it was a limitation of the clinical trials. So our team, I was in epidemiology and outcomes research at the time, and the person was Gil Italian. What he did was a study, the first ever study to show that olanzapine was significantly associated with new onset of type 2 diabetes. It was a small budget study, but it was right on. It got published in the British Medical Journal. Within 4 years, there were 24 more studies that were published. 17 were positive. The ones that were adequately powered and followed our methods. The field changed, and there became a great awareness of the importance of considering metabolic profiles of these drugs in prescribing behavior. And it gave a big lift to Abilify and other drugs that had a good safety profile. Limited commercial dollars and infrastructure, and yet something that was extremely important and drove a very substantial part of the success of the product.
wow, yeah, that's a great example. And Bill, I don't know if you want to respond to that, Bill Gibson, but
Yeah, I think you just said it so eloquently, and I'm so appreciative of your comments too, Pablo. I think in general terms, it really speaks to finding the patient that is most likely to benefit. And this comes to the fore, I think, with what Bill was saying as well earlier about Alzheimer's disease. I mean, payers are going to want to know how can we enrich the population? How can we find those patients that really do have the pathology that are likely to benefit from these agents? And I think with Abilify, that was very successful. It wasn't every patient that should get it, but there was a definitive population. And there was a lot of data, to your point, Pablo, vetting and supporting the rationale for patient selection with Abilify. So I think this was a really, really good case of right patient, right intervention at the right point in their disease course. And we say it all the time, but it's not every day that we find an example play out in real time that actually illustrates this. And I think that was a very good example.
no, great. And don't go back on mute quite yet, Bill, because you I know if you say it's an alliance brand, which I know both of the Bills for sure have plenty of experience here, but Bill Gibson, if you'd like to kick us off here, what would you consider?
Yeah, I think there's a couple thoughts here. So really, when you're thinking about the alliance context, and I'm sure all my colleagues here on the panel have had different experiences as well here and can say a lot about it. But in mine, I think the key is to really have a very candid and honest and early assessment of what the strengths of each player are, what those capabilities are. I think where we've seen really good success have been the times that we've taken inventory of really what is it that's already in place, whether it's commercialization hubs, multi-channel capabilities, whether it's field HEOR, whether it's footprints in the go-to-market structure. There can be so many different places where the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented. And I think an honest assessment of that is very, very helpful. The complement to that is that I think oftentimes during drug development, especially in riskier areas. There can be a bit more focus on alliances, the benefit of the alliance to offset the clinical development risk, and that's very important. But I think we also have to plan for success and think through how to structure the alliance agreement in a way that also has the commercialization process in mind, bearing in consideration all of those relative strengths of each partner. So I think those are just some dynamics. Obviously, once there's a really common view of which company has relative strengths and what brought each one to the table in the first place, I think the execution can flow very, very seamlessly.
No, that's great. And I love that the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented comment. That was so perfect, where you see that happen way too much as well. Bill Renzo, anything you'd like to add here regarding the alliance?
Yeah, I mean, most of these alliances you've seen is generally big pharma with a small startup biotech, very different cultures across the organizations. And in the three that I've been in, what I found is that, a good takeaways was land on the strategy early. They put the alliance together and then they're already running to the marketing teams to build tactics and stuff. Land on the strategy first and hold hands on it. Land on the claims you want to make about your product and hold hands on it before you go down the road of building tactical plans and all that stuff, because then the wheels just spin because the philosophies are just different. So I think they have to come to the table first and foremost, say, this is our payer strategy, this is our HCP strategy, this is our patient strategy. We all agree on this. These are the claims we want to make. Now let's go out and execute. Oftentimes the alliance comes together and they're already starting to build materials and they haven't even landed on a strategy yet. That to me is what's ruined a lot of these alliances.
That is a great point. Yeah, it happens. You see so many different cases and how it's done well versus done wrong, and that definitely speaks to where you can tell there's problems. Everyone's just running off on their own marketing tactics and campaigns, etc., without being really aligned on a strategy. No, it's a great point. And if anyone else from your experience want to add in here on alliance with factoring in this parent scenario?
Yeah, there was a very interesting article in Barron's recently on gene therapy. And it was very positive about gene therapy, positions it as the future, but the warning to investors is be patient. And one of the reasons that you have to be patient is because the infrastructure isn't quite there yet. A lot of challenges in manufacturing and scaling, right? And so what the companies that I think have an advantage have done is they've started with smaller diseases. And they're a great way to start in terms of safety is start with one organ where you have localized therapy, the eye. That's what Barron's calls out. And so these companies are working on really rare eye diseases first. In the long run, they want to invest, of course, in diabetic retinopathy. And so that's where you have to be patient. And so for a large company coming to invest with one of these companies, I think the proposition is not that you're going to make a ton of money off of a rare eye disease. I think it's that you're going to develop the scaling, the manufacturing, the technology, and you're going to go after diabetic retinopathy in the end. And there's a company that I like to that effect that is avoiding some of the competition in the eye diseases by targeting the ear. That's about therapeutics. Rare cause of hearing loss deficiency, genetic, you address it. You can do therapy in just one ear, right? It's safer. You can approach that, but that's a build for the future. And potential alliance partners need to see that. It's a build for the future to eventually go after something like age-related hearing loss.
Great example for sure. And just a few additional thoughts here. So when it comes to that, like optimizing your spend on what will really move the needle, as we're all talking about here, right? So potentially like running a ENPV model on commercial clinical options and looking at sensitivity analysis, which I have experience doing with Pablo, with Bill Gibson, with a few on the line. But basically thinking about sensitivity analysis like a tornado chart can help you really identify what's the highest ROI initiatives, and then figuring out like how you should invest based on that, right, is one thing to think about, of course, when you're starting to quantify it and make it a financial consideration. Figuring out your strengths and how you can amplify those despite less resources, right? Considering analogs that have won in similar circumstances, what did they do? Of course, as mentioned, partnering is clearly an option to consider here. For an alliance brand, You've got to ensure clarity around alliance roles, communication checkpoints, strategy, KPIs. Over communicating is your friend in this instance, and just to lean on what other people are saying also, over communicate early and form alignment there early is definitely key. So moving on to our last scenario for the conversation. So number 6, there's only so much money to spend and you want to maximize ROI. So Pablo, how about you kick us off here?
Well, I like the examples of the gene therapy companies. That's one of the things they're doing, starting with the rare disease. And so we call that a niche and growth strategy. I think another good example of that was the development of CAR-T. It also speaks to alliance partners. I think Novartis is very wise to get in early on that once you had the proof of principle. And so you focus on that smaller condition, right, and a few cases and a proof of principle. And then I think you're going to have a big return on investment if you can partner with someone who shows your vision of the future.
Mm-hmm. Great point. So, and yeah, I know we're approaching time soon here. So, Anuj, if you'd like to add any other thoughts to highlight here, would love to hear them.
Maybe just reflecting a bit on this discussion, Pablo, you kind of hinted at, which is it's not just about what comes next, it's about the longer term horizon. And I think we have so much to learn from other industries, and that's what I think biopharma is at one of the most exciting places for any young person to join today, because from the innovative side, we got such a high hurdle to overcome, that competition so strong. Then from a commercial perspective, there's so many things that we can do that are innovative because we have to, and necessity is the mother of invention, and therefore we get a lot of leeway now to try things we haven't tried before. And if you look at the life cycle of a product or the business plan of the future, you look at what Apple's done, and all of us have followed them because they're such a big part of our lives. And I bet many of us know their strategy in retrospect about how they built up a certain chip or a certain optics function or a certain touch technology, or they bought a certain company to build in a technology that's going to show up 5 years later. It's like we know as consumers actually what their roadmap has been for their company. And I think we have an opportunity in biopharma to think like that as well. What's the roadmap for the future? And, whether it's gene therapies or it's the CAR-Ts or it's the RLTs, all of these are going to demand us to do things very differently. And I think it's cool for us to be able to, as business people and leaders in the science forum, to plan it out.
Mm. No, it's a great tie to thinking, cross industry here as well. So yeah, and only a few things to add from my point of view. Of course, it's worth considering like return on investment benchmarks, right, on different marketing and promo tactics, PTRS benchmarks. So like what is kind of the standard for probability of technical and regulatory success that you're comparing against. One useful method for this is, again, kind of quantifying the ENPV of options, plotting that out on a probability versus NPV distribution. So you can see kind of what's your likelihood of failure versus the amount of money that you're planning to invest. And so, you can make, and I have in the past with people on the panel here, help make that decision based on if you see a very high distribution of NPV that's going to be lost due to a failure, right? So if you consider this at the portfolio level, you can really pinpoint whether you should invest in an asset or if you should invest in other areas of the portfolio based on your expected ROI. So, to the point mentioned at the end there by Anuj, definitely analogs, thinking outside of the industry is key and worthwhile to consider here, particularly with regards to forecast impact, potential return. And finally, again, that sensitivity analysis can really help to pinpoint what will drive the most value. So yes, and I know now I think we're pretty much at time, but I just want to thank everyone for a wonderful discussion today. I can hand things back over to Ellen to conclude here, but everyone, it was an amazing discussion. I really am thankful for your participation. And with that, I will hand over to Ellen.
Well, thank you, Neil, and thank you to all our wonderful speakers. It was truly an engaging conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, all our attendees. Be on the lookout for an email with a direct direct link to today's recorded presentation and a follow-up white paper on this topic. Of course, we welcome the opportunity to speak to you directly, so please reach out to either myself or to Neil, and I'll redirect you to Neil in that case. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.